Hey everybody, John Peterson here, and today I've got a special edition of Which One Works. For those that have been subscribed and following my channel, you know that I will take two photographs or a series of photographs and kind of compare them to say which one works and which one doesn't. But today I'm going to dive into why a photograph works and why I chose this particular angle or the elements that are in a composition. I'm going to dissect a finished photograph and kind of point out a few things to help you, hopefully, when you're in the field creating these images. Now, you know, when we're out in the field taking photographs, oftentimes it's really hard to slow down and pay attention to everything that is in your viewfinder. Too often we focus just on our subject and we don't look at all of the elements surrounding the subject. Too often we look at the whole scene and we don't look at its constituent parts, or maybe we don't think like a designer. And I say that with a little bit of a grain of salt because oftentimes now I look at myself as a visual designer as I put together elements, patterns, shapes, textures, and colors into a composition to make it be pleasing, to make it work. And it's my job as a photographer to move my feet, change my focal lengths, to create this composition in a way that I find pleasing. So let's jump into an example or two of why it works. So as a landscape and nature photographer, you know, I cannot control the weather. I can't control the sunlight. I can't control the oceans. I can't control a lot of the factors that go into a successful photograph. But what I can control is what's included in my photograph and what's not included. I can control the angle to my subject, the height to my subject, the focal length that I'm using for how I want to compress or elongate the scene. There's a lot of creative controls that I have as a photographer in order to depict a natural landscape. And you know what really struck me, I was putting together a presentation that I have to give here in a couple of weeks, and I was using this image as an example, and it really struck me that sometimes a simple image is oftentimes a difficult one to shoot, but is also a great instructor. And so I kind of want to use this to show you what I saw and why I think this one works and why it works. So jumping into an image, I will critique this for you. Jumping into this, I'm really going to start off looking at the sky. And the first thing I notice in the sky, of course, is this horizontal line of the clouds mimicking the horizontal line of the bluff, right? So that's a really nice piece of symmetry that I have, which is great. And I talked about, noticing everything in your composition. Well, the one thing I didn't notice that I don't really care for is this cloud up here in the upper left-hand corner of the frame. And the reason I don't particularly like that is that if there's anything bright in the corners or in the peripheral vision, it tends to take somebody's attention away from the main part or your subject of the image. So that's one thing that I really don't particularly care for. But that's okay. I'll let it go for now, which is fine. And this is an image, just to back up a little bit, that I shot in Monument Valley, and we were on some Navajo's property that had this hogan, or a couple of hogans, which are a dwelling and a ceremonial structure made out of sticks and mud. It's really kind of a neat little traditional building that they use for a lot of different purposes. But the symmetry of this shot is first what attracted me. The second thing that attracted me is the dappled sunlight that was hitting the cliff faces behind it. Now, one of the first things that I did is wait until I got sunlight on at least one, if not two, cliff faces, which you can see over here. And this, I really like. It adds a nice pop and it adds a spotlight to the cliffs. And what's really kind of cool is I've got this really bright structure here and this bright cliff face and this bright cliff face back here that are all related and balanced. So I've got this beautiful, beautiful sort of triangle going on here of bright objects. And as we know, our eyes are always drawn to the brightest part of an image. And in this case, I want people to look at the cliff face. I want them to look at this hogan. And then I also want them to explore the back of the scene. So I have this light back there that's attracting them further off into the frame. Now, when I talked about positioning and spacing and moving my feet, the one thing when I was shooting this that I was really cognizant of is this shadow here and this hogan here and what their relationships were. Now, the cool thing is that this little curve kind of mimics this curve, which is great. But the most important thing that I was concerned about was this space here. The space between the shadow and the other hogan. I wanted enough space so that they separated. If the shadow was overlapping the secondary hogan back there, it would have kind of destroyed the shot. That hogan would not have been a decent compositional element because the shadow would have blocked part of it out and I would have merged kind of two elements. If we think about elements, I've got this as an element, this shadow's an element, and this is an element. So I've got all three of these that they need to be distinct and separate on their own, but also work together as a whole. That sort of makes sense? So thinking about shape, the other cool thing, I've got this shape here, I've got, this sort of rounded shape here. These mimic each other. But then if you look further, I've got this rounded shape, this rounded shape, this rounded shape, this rounded shape. Going the other direction, I've kind of got a little shape back there. I've got all of these shapes that are fairly similar and they support and enhance one another. So I saw those in the field and I was really cognizant that I wanted to make sure that I got those in the shot to the point where I felt that they could subconsciously add to the strength of the photograph. I was aware of this really dark shadow line that was running through, sort of bisecting the image. Not much I could do about it photographically other than get lowered down to the ground to try to minimize the midground, but what that would have done was put the pipe, it would have intersected the top of this cliff, which I didn't want. So I settled and left this dark line in the photograph. And lastly, the last thing I was really conscious about was this edge over here and where this cliff met the edge on the right. There's just a whisker of space between this outcropping of rock and the edge of the frame. If I would have cut off that outcropping halfway, it would have looked unresolved and unfinished. If I would have left too much space, well, that included too much sky and too much other foreground. So I got it as close as I could to the edge of this outcropping here without cutting it off in order to maximize the proximity that the hogan, as close as I was to the hogan and the cliffs, I wanted those to really fill the frame as much as possible. So I kind of hope that's starting to make a little bit of sense for you. And let me say that, being able to identify and evaluate these types of things in the field should be, in my opinion, a goal for every photographer. Because that's part of the art of composition, is putting together these elements into a composition in a pleasing way that tells the story that you want to tell. And it's a way of thinking that sometimes it's new to people. So what I would recommend is practice at home. Look at your images and start to deconstruct them, dissect them. Look at things where you can, and then you can start to discern patterns, shapes, what works, what doesn't work, and through that you gradually start to train your vision and your artistic mind to see that in the field when you're composing photographs. All right, let's take a look at a couple more examples of why it works and things that you may not have seen before. All right, let's take a look at a couple more examples of why it works. Here's a shot from Bandon Beach down in Southern Oregon. And for those of you that have ever been there, know that there are a ton of sea stacks out in the ocean. And so part of my craft of composition is knowing what to exclude. And in this case, I positioned myself and picked an appropriate focal length to exclude all of the other sea stacks except for the 3 rocks that you see here in the composition. This shot for me is all about balance. It's why I shot this. And balance is really kind of the whole reason why. You know, I've got this great rock here and this great rock here. Balances left to right. I've got these reflections down here which balance wonderfully left to right. You know, I've got this in a mirrored reflection which balances top to bottom and left to right, which is great. And you know, folks, I'll tell you, notice where I put the horizon line. I put the horizon line just about right in the middle of the composition. Normally, a lot of people will tell you don't do that. We don't like horizons right in the middle. But because my intent for this image is to shoot something that's very balanced, I wanted to split the geographic real estate of this composition in half with the horizon line. So that's why I put that directly in the middle of the frame. The other things that I paid attention to is the space above these stacks between the edge of the frame. And conversely is the space down here as well. Very important. I needed to leave enough space for these subjects to breathe. So it's a pretty picture, yes, but it's balanced. It's symmetrical. And that's why this shot works. Let's jump over to wintertime in the Tetons. And I run a photo workshop out here every year and just love this area. And this is sunrise along Molten Row, and this is one of the barns that are out there. And I've got a really strong horizontal motif going on here, which was intentional on my part. You know, if we look at the sky, I've got these horizontal bands of color in the sky, all sort of reinforcing one another, which is fantastic. Of course, I've got, you know, the mountain peaks, but these 3, we love things in odd numbers. And I've got 3 really prominent peaks that stick out above all the rest. Jumping down a little bit, look at the barn. And in particularly, look at the peak of the barn and the peak of the peak. They are virtually lined up. I wanted this barn and this peak to mimic and shadow each other. So it was very intentional where I positioned myself. So this peak of the barn lines up with the peak of the mountain. Now back to kind of the horizontal aspects. Look at this outbuilding out here. I've got these horizontal logs and then horizontal logs through here. Then I've got these horizontal railings that run all along here. Very strong horizontal element. And then I've got a horizontal band of foliage down here, and then this open space with some horizontal elements to it as well. And last but not least, horizontal band of fog. These are all things that I was very conscious and aware of when I was out in the field. And then again, lastly, I've got 3 main elements here in the midground. Again, we love things in 3s. And I was very intentional to include these 3 things. And the other thing that's kind of cool is that they are on an upward trajectory of height. So that lines up extremely nicely. So you can start to pick apart your images and notice things that work or don't work in your shots. And then lastly, this shot from the Palouse. Of course, we love the Palouse, rolling wheat fields, beautiful sunsets, and this is really can be a very challenging place to shoot because there's not an obvious subject. So what you do is you put together interesting patterns, shapes, and textures and colors and light to form a pleasing composition. And here what I wanted to point out to you guys again is sort of the repeating patterns that I have going on here. I've got this really strong cloud on a diagonal line leading up into the sky. I've got these fainter clouds that are also doing the same thing. So I've got very much a repeating pattern up here in the sky. And then I take that pattern down here into the land and I've got the same things being reinforced down here below. Now what's cool about this is I've got multiple patterns or multiple elements going on here. And notice the bright highlights on some of these rolling hills, and I've got a line of light going down this way, going down this way, going down this way, and going down this way. So I've got these great repeating patterns happening. And then not to mention, I've got my highlights up here and then areas of shadow here that work extremely well, highlights and darker. All of these things were very conscious as I was composing my shot. All right, well, there you go. There's a little bit of why it works. Not just which one works, but why it works. And, folks, one of the best ways to grow your photographic skills is being able to compose to the best of your ability in camera. I try to get everything as right as I can in camera and not relying on fixing it in post. And that includes composition. And I've gotten to the point now where I see myself more as a visual designer and a visual communicator because I'm making choices about what is in my shot and what is not in my shot based upon the subject and based upon the story, mood, and emotion that I want to craft in this photograph. So I make a lot of choices around what is and what is not included in these shots. And it's taken a while to get here. And I won't fool you, it takes a lot of work to train your mind to see more creatively. I see patterns, textures, colors, shapes, light, qualities, all those things as much or more than I see actual subjects. I could be in front of a beautiful waterfall or Mesa Arch or any of these things, and yes, I see the subject, but I spend more of my creative energy looking at everything but the subject. Because it's all of those supporting elements around your subject that is going to make the difference between a good photograph and a great photograph. So I hope that helps you today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down below. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. That would be awesome. And I hope you guys have a great day and stay tuned for the next video.